Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. December 17th, 1944. A cold morning outside WWII, Belgium. Imagine the scene. A still, icy dawn blankets the Belgian countryside, the breath of a lone military policeman hanging like smoke in the frigid air. A jeep pulls up to the checkpoint, crunching over the frost-hardened earth. 3 soldiers sit inside, dressed in convincing American uniforms, their rifles slung just right, their English passable, almost natural. Almost. But Sergeant William Creel wasn't looking for almost. He had been briefed on an unthinkable possibility, a warning that bent the rules of war and shattered the assumptions of military honor. Could it be true? Could German soldiers really be masquerading as Americans, operating behind friendly lines, using the enemy's language, and wearing their very skin? He raised his hand, halting the vehicle, and asked for the password. A pause. Not long, but long enough. Suspicion took root. He repeated the demand. This time their answer stumbled, their fluency faltered. That's when Creel's eyes narrowed. The details betrayed them. British Sten guns, oddly out of place. No American patrol would carry such weapons. In minutes, the charade collapsed. The men were disarmed, detained, unmasked. Beneath the olive drab of the U.S. Army, the unmistakable gray of the Wehrmacht lay hidden. Their names would soon echo through history. Unteroffizier Manfred Pernas, Oberfähnrich Günther Billing, Gefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt, the first captured infiltrators of Hitler's most desperate gamble. They were more than prisoners. They were the opening act in a psychological war that would soon grip the American army with paralyzing doubt. Trust began to fray. At every roadblock, suspicion grew. Every checkpoint turned into a gauntlet of questions, not about military tactics, but about baseball teams, movie stars, state trivia, and it had all begun nearly 2 months earlier, far from the snow-covered Ardennes. October 22nd, 1944. Hitler's headquarters, Rostenburg, East Prussia. Now picture another scene. Dark paneled walls, a heavy silence thick with anticipation. Adolf Hitler summons one of his most feared operatives, the man who'd snatched Mussolini from a mountaintop fortress, SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny. The Führer doesn't mince words. He lays out a plan as audacious as it is unorthodox. An operation of shadows where uniforms lie and accents deceive. The mission? A lightning counter-offensive through the Ardennes, smashing into the thin American lines and racing toward Antwerp. The goal? To cleave apart the Allied armies, to mirror the triumph of May 1940, when German tanks sliced through France to the sea. But time was the enemy. The offensive had to move faster than the Allies could react. The key? Securing intact bridges over the Meuse River. Destroyed spans would cripple the advance. Intact ones? A straight shot to victory. That's where Skorzeny came in. He would assemble a special formation, Panzer Brigade 150, trained not only in warfare, but in deception. These weren't ordinary troops. Their job was to move behind enemy lines not as Germans, but as Americans. Hitler's next words stopped even Skorzeny cold. The unit would wear captured Allied uniforms. Was this bold or madness? The implications were chilling. According to the Hague Convention of 1907, any soldier captured in enemy uniform risked being classified as a spy and executed. No protections, no mercy. A wave of debate followed. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt both weighed the consequences. Hitler, ever defiant of convention, offered a compromise. His soldiers would don enemy clothing only for infiltration and sabotage, never for open combat. The moment fighting began, they would switch to their own uniforms. That, he insisted, preserved their status as lawful combatants. With his orders in hand, Skorzeny got to work. October 25th, the search begins. Within days, Skorzeny submitted his plans to Jodl. He needed 3,300 men, but not just any men, English speakers, men who knew not only the words, but the rhythm, the slang, the feel of American speech. And so the call went out. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht sent an urgent request to all Western Front commands. Volunteers fluent in English, familiar with American idiom, needed for secret operations. The order bore the signature of Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel himself. It was a calculated risk. Skorzeny knew such a blatant request wouldn't remain secret for long. He pleaded to cancel the operation, fearing Allied interception. But Hitler, ever enamored with boldness, refused. Sure enough, by November 30th, Allied intelligence had decoded the order. But instead of bracing for infiltration, they laughed it off. Surely the Germans weren't that reckless, that desperate? They were. The recruits arrive, and the illusion begins. Volunteers trickled in from all corners of the German military, soldiers with passable schoolboy English or a few phrases learned on leave. Most had no idea what awaited them. Take Fritz Christ, for example, just 21, an airman trained as a translator. He believed his role would be tame, interrogating American POWs far from danger. Instead, he found himself behind barbed wire in the remote Bavarian training camp at Grafenwöhr. Security was absolute. One careless letter home, and a man was shot. There could be no leaks, no room for error. The plan was in motion. The uniforms were ready. The accents rehearsed. The question now was simple. Would the deception hold? And how would the American army react when the face of the enemy looked just like their own? December 17th, 1944, near Wildest, Belgium, a frost-bitten dawn. Picture it, the breathless silence of early morning, broken only by the low hum of an approaching engine. The Belgian countryside lies frozen under a veil of hoar-frost, each breath a ghost in the frigid air. At a lonely checkpoint stands a military policeman, eyes sharp despite the biting cold. A jeep slows to a halt before him. Inside, 3 men in American uniforms, armed with what seem like standard-issue rifles, speaking English that lands almost perfectly on the ear. Almost. But Sergeant William Creel wasn't fooled by appearances. He had received a briefing that felt more like a plot twist than military intelligence, a warning that defied the traditions of soldiering. Could it be? Could German troops really be moving among them in disguise, wearing American gear, speaking the language of jazz, baseball, and Hollywood? He raised his hand and demanded the password. The response? A moment of hesitation, subtle but deadly. He asked again, his tone now razor-edged. The reply came, but it cracked under pressure. Their accent frayed, their confidence wavered. Then Creel spotted the telltale detail, British Sten submachine guns slung across their backs. No American patrol would carry those. In moments, the masquerade unraveled. They were stripped of their weapons, placed under arrest. Underneath their olive uniforms, they wore the steel gray of the Wehrmacht. The names of the captured infiltrators would soon ripple through Allied lines like a cold shock. Unteroffizier Manfred Pernas, Oberfähnrich Günther Billing, Gefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt. They weren't just enemy soldiers. They were ghosts in the machine, the vanguard of a campaign not of bullets, but of doubt. What followed was chaos of a new kind. American troops began interrogating each other at every stop. Passwords gave way to pop quizzes. What's the capital of Nebraska? Who played the lead in Gone with the Wind? What team won the World Series in '39? Each checkpoint became a stage, each soldier a suspect. But to understand how it came to this war of paranoia and identity, we must go back nearly 2 months, away from the snow-choked Ardennes, to a place steeped in shadows and ambition. October 22, 1944, Rastenburg, East Prussia, Hitler's Wolf's Lair. Now shift the scene. A cavernous chamber cloaked in dim lamplight, heavy curtains, maps sprawled across oak tables, and in the center, Adolf Hitler summoning one of his most trusted and dangerous agents, SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny. This was no ordinary briefing. It was a proposal of audacity and illusion, the sort of plan that shattered rules and rewrote them in the same breath. Germany, Hitler explained, would launch a desperate counterattack through the dense forests of the Ardennes. The goal? To split the Allied front wide open and seize the vital port of Antwerp. A maneuver reminiscent of the thunderclap blitzkrieg of 1940. Tanks hurtling to the coast, cutting the Allies in two. But this time, the clock was the real adversary. The offensive had to blaze forward before the Allies could regroup or destroy key bridges over the Meuse. A single intact crossing could change everything. Enter Skorzeny. His mission: form an elite force, Panzer Brigade 150, not for conventional warfare, but for chaos. Their task wasn't to charge, it was to deceive. They would slip behind enemy lines, sabotage supply routes, reroute traffic, and spread panic. The twist? They would do it dressed as Americans. Even Skorzeny, the commando who had once swooped in to rescue Mussolini from the jaws of captivity, paused. This wasn't just unconventional, it was lethal. According to the Hague Convention of 1907, any soldier captured in enemy uniform could be treated not as a prisoner of war, but as a spy, subject to summary execution. Debate swirled. High-ranking officers, including General Oberst Alfred Jodl and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, raised concerns. But Hitler, ever the gambler, offered his rationale. As long as Skorzeny's men changed back into German uniforms before engaging in direct combat, their actions would remain within the boundaries of legality. With that narrow reassurance, the mission was greenlit. October 25th, operation begins to take shape. Skorzeny wasted no time. He outlined his needs to Jodl. 3,300 men fluent in English, familiar with the cadence and quirks of American speech, not just soldiers, but actors in a deadly masquerade. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht issued a bold order to every command on the Western Front. The directive, signed personally by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, called for English-speaking volunteers with knowledge of American slang and behavior. Skorzeny knew this broadcast would not stay secret. He feared exposure and requested a cancellation. Hitler flatly refused. Sure enough, the Allies intercepted the message by November 30th, but instead of sounding the alarm, they dismissed it as German bluster. After all, who would dare attempt such madness? The answer: Otto Skorzeny. The illusion begins. Volunteers began to arrive, a trickle of men from all branches of the German military. Some had studied abroad, others picked up English from films or fellow prisoners. Few understood what they were really volunteering for. Take Fritz Christ, just 21, a Luftwaffe private trained in translation. He assumed he'd be interviewing American POWs from a desk far from the front lines. Instead, he found himself confined behind barbed wire at a secluded training compound in Grafenwöhr, Bavaria. Security was ruthless. Every word spoken, every scrap of paper was monitored. One recruit was executed for letting too much slip in a letter home. The deception was underway. Uniforms were prepared, American helmets fitted, slang was drilled into memory, accents rehearsed until tongues bled. And now, as the operation neared execution, one question loomed larger than all others. Would the ruse succeed, or would the American army, taught to trust the man beside them, suddenly see their own reflections and wonder? Friend or foe? December 1944. Malmedy and beyond, the Phantom Army stirs. The plan had been approved. Panzer Brigade 150 received orders to mobilize south of Malmedy, placing themselves under the command of the elite 1st SS Panzer Division. But by the time that order rippled down the chain, Skorzeny's ghost soldiers, the disguised commandos, were already deep behind American lines. Some had succeeded, sowing confusion, changing signposts, redirecting convoys, disrupting radio links. But many others faltered, undone not by bullets, but by words. Passwords they couldn't remember, questions they couldn't answer, uniform details that didn't add up. British Sten guns slung on their backs, German-issue boots, broken grammar, and the wrong twang of English under stress. Their capture wasn't just a tactical failure, it became a spark. And what followed was not just fear, it was full-blown hysteria. Iville, December 17th. A spark becomes a blaze. The arrest of Manfred Pernass, Günther Billing, and Wilhelm Schmidt near Iville was the flashpoint. Interrogators worked them hard. Then came the statement, a line from Schmidt that detonated across Allied intelligence like a bombshell. The operation's true goal, he claimed, was not bridges or sabotage, but the Supreme Headquarters itself. Their real mission, he said, was to reach and either capture or assassinate General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Was it true? Was Schmidt misinformed, or was he spinning deliberate disinformation, playing into the fog of war? No one knew. No proof of such an order has ever surfaced. But it didn't matter. The Supreme Commander under siege. By that same day, Versailles had become a fortress. General Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, found himself under virtual house arrest. Armed guards checked every person who entered the headquarters. His movements were restricted. The irony was grim. The man orchestrating the liberation of Europe couldn't leave his own office, and it wore on him. By Christmas, Eisenhower had had enough. Enraged by the lockdown, he declared he would rather face an assassin than remain a prisoner of paranoia. "I have to get out," he reportedly fumed. "I don't care if they shoot me." But the wave of fear had already broken over the Allied rear. An army gripped by doubt. The German assault in the Ardennes had already sown chaos. Now, suspicion infected every checkpoint, every passing jeep. The rear lines, meant for safety and resupply, transformed into a paranoid gauntlet. Military police interrogated every soldier they encountered, not for strategy or credentials, but for culture. The questions became infamous. What's the capital of Illinois? Who won the 1940 World Series? Who is Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? Where does the guard stand in a football lineup? Who's married to Betty Grable? What team plays at Wrigley Field? Who is Frank Sinatra? What's the president's dog's name? Geography, sports, movies, slang, anything to unmask imposters. But the system was chaos. Often it exposed not spies, but the vast and diverse gaps within America itself. The Americans interrogating Americans. Many real American soldiers couldn't answer the questions. A farm boy from Kansas might know every inch of the prairie, but not a thing about the Yankees. A city kid from Brooklyn might never have heard of Illinois' state capital. Some had never watched a film in their lives. Others couldn't recall a pop song, if their life depended on it. And in this case, it nearly did. General Omar Bradley himself was detained after giving the correct answer, Springfield, to the Illinois capital question. The MP, mistakenly believing it was Chicago, held him until his identity could be confirmed. Brigadier General Bruce Clark was stopped at gunpoint for claiming the Cubs played in the American League. A captain spent an entire week in custody simply for wearing souvenir German boots. And the British, they fared worse. Officers like David Niven, better known as a Hollywood actor, found themselves frozen in place when they couldn't identify American baseball teams. "I haven't the faintest idea," Niven reportedly responded when asked about the 1940 World Series. British troops were held for not knowing the intricacies of U.S. geography or Mickey Mouse's social life. Some Americans, furious at the absurdity, deliberately gave wrong answers in protest and would detain themselves. Others bristled at being grilled by enlisted men and lashed out, sparking yet more delays. The paranoia bogged down entire armies. Convoys stalled. Orders lost urgency. Reinforcements were late. Trust became a rare currency. Behind enemy lines, the infiltrators unravel. The pressure was no less brutal for those still embedded behind American lines. The sudden obsession with cultural trivia exposed the weak spots in their training. They knew military routines, insignias, formations, but Betty Grable's husband? Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? They were undone not by firepower, but by pop culture. Some abandoned roads entirely, slinking through forests to avoid checkpoints. Others tried to bluff their way through, but few succeeded. They were strangers in a land of tiny details. By the end of the month, the results were in. Between December 16 and 31, U.S. forces had captured 23 participants of Operation Greif. 16 were caught in December alone. The leader, Gunther Schultz, was taken months later and brought to trial in May 1945. Justice swift and final. The legal consequences were clear. Article 23 of the Hague Convention forbids the misuse of enemy uniforms. Anyone caught wearing enemy insignia during combat could be tried, not as a soldier, but as a spy. The first trial began at Henri Chapelle on December 21st. Pernas, Billing, and Schmidt were the defendants. The evidence was overwhelming. Captured in full American uniform with American identification and weapons, yet wearing German field gray beneath. The trial did not last long. The verdict? Guilty. The sentence? Death. On December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, the 3 men were led to the execution ground. Captain J. Iser of the 633rd Medical Clearing Station pinned white paper targets over their hearts. Schmidt's glasses were taken. They were blindfolded. Billing's last words: "Long live our Führer, Adolf Hitler." The rifles cracked in unison. The bodies fell, lifeless. They were buried and later moved to the German military cemetery at Lommel, Belgium. now lying among more than 39,000 fallen soldiers. The reckoning continues. Between December 24th and 31, 13 more of Skorzeny's men stood trial. Each faced the same charges. Each was found guilty. Each was executed by firing squad. Wilhelm Weisenfeld, Manfred Brony, Hans Reich, Arno Krause, Günther Schiltz, Erhard Miegel, Horst Gerlich, Norbert Pollack, Rolf Benjamin Meyer, Hans Witzak, Otto Struller, Alfred Franz, Antony Mortzuk. They became the price of deception, men who waged war not with tanks or bullets, but with accents and uniforms, and were crushed under the weight of the rules they broke. Thus ended one of World War II's most bizarre and psychological operations, not with sabotage or assassination, but with paranoia, panic, and a deadly quiz show of American identity. Silent executions, loud echoes, the final acts of Operation Greif, each sentence handed down during the trials of Operation Greif infiltrators, bore the cold weight of legality. Senior Allied commanders reviewed every detail, scrutinizing charges and ensuring that the verdicts conformed to international law. There was no bloodlust, only military necessity. And so, when the condemned were led before the firing squads, it was done with grim precision, dispassionate, methodical, irreversible. Team leader Günther Schultz, captured months later, stood trial in May 1945, after Germany's formal surrender. The delay remains shrouded in uncertainty. Why was his prosecution postponed? Who gave the final order to carry out his execution? The historical record offers no definitive answer. What is known is this: the United States Ninth Army carried out the sentence. On June 14, 1945, Schultz was executed near Braunschweig. In total, 17 men from Operation Greif were executed for violating the laws of war by wearing enemy uniforms in combat. Their lives ended not on the battlefield, but before the barrels of Allied rifles. Tactically insignificant, psychologically devastating. And what did their mission accomplish? From a military standpoint, almost nothing. No Meuse River bridges were taken. No demolition teams halted Allied advances. Critical communications remained largely intact. A few signs were turned to misdirect traffic. Some telephone lines were cut. A handful of American units received misleading orders, most of which were quickly corrected. The grand tactical objectives that Hitler envisioned never materialized, yet the psychological ripple was immense, far outstripping the operation's limited physical effects. For weeks, American forces operated as if danger lurked behind every uniform. The fear of infiltrators reshaped how the Allied command functioned. It reached the top. Eisenhower himself, the supreme commander, was effectively sealed inside his headquarters at Versailles. While chaos unfolded in the Ardennes, he remained distant from the front. His isolation, a direct result of the Greif rumor that his life was in danger. Trust fractured. Movement stalled. The consequences were not just symbolic. The paranoia that swept through the American rear had tangible effects on battlefield coordination. Checkpoints mushroomed across the landscape, delaying not just trucks and tanks, but decisions. Units that should have moved in hours took days. Reinforcements critical to holding the line were slowed by suspicion. Morale was also a casualty. Soldiers, already strained by the German onslaught, found themselves scrutinizing comrades instead of focusing on the enemy. Commanders were questioned by their own men. Orders were second-guessed. The invisible enemy, the possibility that anyone might be German, corroded the cohesion of frontline units. The bulge expands, Despite Operation Greif's collapse, the Ardennes offensive, the infamous Battle of the Bulge, thundered forward. German armored columns punched deep into American lines, forcing a desperate Allied scramble. The bulge that gave the battle its name was a literal deformation of the front, the result of Hitler's last great gamble. In Bastogne, American defenders of the 101st Airborne Division held out under siege, surrounded but unbroken. On December 22nd, German officers approached under a flag of truce and offered surrender terms. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's reply was a single word, typed and delivered like a slap to the face: nuts. The Germans, confused, asked for clarification. The American answer was blunt: it means go to hell. Bastogne held. Then came salvation in the form of Patton's breakthrough. On December 26th, General George S. Patton's Third Army, having executed an astonishing pivot north, shattered the German siege. His maneuver, a 90-degree turn under winter conditions and amidst chaotic lines, was a masterpiece of operational flexibility. By early January, the tide had turned. Allied counterattacks erased the bulge and re-established the front. The Battle of the Bulge, which had begun on December 16, 1944, would not conclude until January 25, 1945. It was the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army outside its own Civil War. Over 1 million soldiers took part. American losses soared beyond $80,000, with 19,000 killed and 23,000 taken prisoner. German casualties mirrored the scale, but unlike the Allies, the Wehrmacht lacked the reserves to replenish its ranks. The Ardennes offensive was Germany's final strategic blow in the West. It failed. Hitler had placed his last chips on the table and lost. Skorzeny, the man behind the masks. For Otto Skorzeny, Operation Greif effectively ended on December 17th. That day, Panzer Brigade 150 abandoned its role as a deception force and transitioned to conventional operations. Days later, on December 21st, they attacked Malmedy, but were thrown back after repeated assaults. Skorzeny himself was wounded by artillery shrapnel near Ligneuville. He recovered and fought on until the end. In May 1945, he surrendered to the 30th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. Army. Awaiting judgment, he spent 2 years in Allied custody. The trial at Dachau. At the 1947 Dachau trials, Skorzeny and 9 officers from Panzer Brigade 150 faced serious accusations. The charges: engaging in combat while wearing American uniforms, improperly acquiring those uniforms and Red Cross parcels from POW camps, and committing perfidious acts against the laws of war. But Skorzeny's defense pivoted on a single crucial point. His men had been under strict orders to remove American uniforms before initiating combat. The disguises were tools of infiltration, not treachery. And then came the moment that shifted the trial: a surprise witness. A British agent turns the tide: FFE Yeo Thomas. An agent of the British Special Operations Executive, himself a man who had worn German uniforms behind enemy lines in France, testified in Skorzeny's defense. The Allied forces, he explained, had used similar tactics. The tribunal drew a key legal distinction. Using enemy uniforms for deception was not equivalent to using them in combat. Since it could not be proven that Skorzeny had ordered his men to fire while disguised, the tribunal acquitted him and his fellow defendants. Controversial justice, the verdict triggered outrage in some quarters. After all, 17 of Skorzeny's men had already been executed for wearing enemy uniforms in December 1944. Why the difference? The answer lay in timing and evidence. The captured infiltrators were caught red-handed. Their disguises were intact. Skorzeny, tried years later, could claim and show that his orders forbade combat in disguise. The tribunal upheld a critical precedent in the laws of war. Wearing enemy uniforms as a ruse de guerre to infiltrate, confuse, or mislead is lawful. Fighting in those uniforms is not. The ruling would shape the understanding of wartime deception for decades to come. Skorzeny escapes. Skorzeny didn't remain in Allied hands for long. In 1948, while held in an internment camp in Darmstadt, he escaped. Operation Greif, though a failure on the battlefield, would live on as a lesson in psychological warfare, military law, and the enduring power of fear. Its true weapon wasn't sabotage or stolen uniforms. It was uncertainty, suspicion, doubt. And for a few cold, chaotic weeks in 1944, it turned the Allied lines into a maze of questions, where the greatest danger might be not who was in front of you, but who was standing right beside you. The echoes of Greif, final movements, lasting lessons. Otto Skorzeny's war did not end with a trial or a cell door slamming shut. His escape in 1948 from an internment camp in Darmstadt became the final act of a story already entangled in deception. Disguised once more, this time aided by former SS officers masquerading as American military police, Skorzeny vanished into post-war Europe. Speculation persists. Some historians whisper of American intelligence agencies turning a blind eye or even quietly assisting his departure, yet no documents have confirmed such collaboration. What is certain, he spent time hidden on a farm in Bavaria, then surfaced briefly in Salzburg, later Paris, before settling in Franco's Spain, a sanctuary for many of Europe's wartime fugitives. In Spain, Skorzeny reinvented himself once again, not as a hunted man, but as a military advisor to Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. He lived in comfort and secrecy, dying of cancer in Madrid on July 5, 1975, at the age of 67. To the end, he expressed no regret for Operation Greif or any of his wartime activities. The rise of a folklore. Yet even as Skorzeny faded into the shadows, the checkpoint interrogations his operation inspired became legend. The impromptu quizzes, asking about Mickey Mouse's girlfriend, who played at Wrigley Field, or the capital of Illinois, evolved into military folklore, a surreal symbol of how culture itself became a weapon. What began as desperation turned into innovation. American MPs, armed with little more than local knowledge and intuition, uncovered the one flaw no disguise could mask: authenticity. Accents could be mimicked, uniforms copied, papers forged. But cultural fluency, that was something learned slowly over years of shared experience. You couldn't fake Little League, or the sound of Frank Sinatra on the radio, or the easy answer to who married Betty Grable. Americans carried that knowledge naturally, like breath, and when challenged, it surfaced instinctively. That was the true genius of the system, chaotic as it was. It worked, not because it was perfect, but because it tapped into the lived, unteachable essence of being American. The 17 men executed for Operation Greif exist now only in history books and in the quiet, manicured grounds of cemeteries like Lommel. There, under simple markers, they rest alongside thousands of others. No special distinction between those who died in combat and those who died by firing squad. Manfred Pernas was just 23 when his life ended. Gunther Billing, 21, shouted his allegiance to Hitler as bullets tore through him. Wilhelm Schmidt, 24, died silently. All were sons, Some were brothers. All had made decisions that led them to that frozen morning, to the blindfolds, the posts, the rifles. Their operation achieved no tactical victories. No bridges were taken. No demolitions struck deep. No command centers were destroyed. And yet, their actions delayed armies, disrupted decisions, and bent the course of battle for days. Their legacy is paradox. Failure in action, success in effect. The power of perception. Operation Greif offered a sobering lesson. Special operations, no matter how ingenious, cannot succeed in a vacuum. Skorzeny's men couldn't take bridges if Kampfgruppe Peiper never reached them. Sabotage cannot substitute for tanks. Deception cannot replace momentum. And yet, the mere threat of Greif reshaped the battlefield. The idea of German infiltrators hiding in American ranks sparked a wave of paranoia that slowed reinforcements, fractured trust, and diverted resources during the crucial opening hours of the Battle of the Bulge. This chasm between perception and reality became a cornerstone of psychological warfare. The fear of what might be was more powerful than what actually was. A battle for the ages. The Battle of the Bulge itself raged on until late January 1945. By then, the Bulge had been flattened, the German advance reversed. Within 4 months, Berlin would fall. Hitler would die in his bunker. Germany would surrender unconditionally on May 8th. But for the men of Operation Greif, the war ended long before that. Their bodies lay in Belgian soil, buried beneath snow and silence. Their mission had failed, yet the ripples of that failure reached deep into Allied operations. Winston Churchill, addressing Parliament on January 18, 1945, even as the battle still smoldered, declared it undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. He underscored its scale. For every British soldier engaged, 30 or 40 Americans stood in the fight. This was their test and their triumph. Lessons etched in uniforms and names. The soldiers at those checkpoints, the ones who asked about baseball, never knew they were crafting legacy. They were following instinct, improvising security. But what they created was something profound, a cultural firewall. It worked because it was built from shared life, the kind of deep identity that can't be taught in weeks. The Germans trained in English, memorized military protocols, even adopted regional slang. But they had not lived American lives. They couldn't answer from instinct. This remains one of the enduring truths drawn from Operation Greif. Culture is not a costume. It's not a vocabulary list or a manual. It is a rhythm, a tone, a shared memory. It takes years, not hours. For modern intelligence and special forces, this has become doctrine. Language alone is not enough. Facts alone are not enough. Only immersion, true cultural fluency, can create plausible cover. Deception's limits. Greif remains a textbook example of both the power and the limitation of special operations. It showed how small teams can create chaos far beyond their size. But it also showed that without conventional military success to build upon, such operations fall short of strategic goals. Deception, no matter how daring, cannot win a war on its own. For military historians, strategists, and lawyers, Operation Greif endures as a case study in the laws of war. The executions of its participants clarified the legal boundaries surrounding the use of enemy uniforms, defining what constitutes lawful ruse versus illegal perfidy. And behind the legal rulings and tactical analysis lies a more human truth, the human cost. Those 17 men, no matter how misguided, were human beings. They had families, histories, lives that ended abruptly, legally, and violently. Their executions marked more than justice. They marked the point at which war's shadow became law's domain. Trials were held swiftly, but not arbitrarily. Under the immense pressure of combat, justice was administered, and precedent was set. Even the American soldiers who guarded the prisoners questioned them, blindfolded them, pulled the triggers. They too bore scars. They had done their duty, but it was a heavy burden. The war did not only end lives on the battlefield, it altered those who survived. A final reflection operation, Greif, never seized a bridge. It never halted a division. It caused little direct death. And yet it became a force multiplier in psychological terms. It delayed decisions. It distorted priorities. It turned camaraderie into suspicion. Its story reminds us that wars are fought not just with bullets and battalions, but with ideas, fear, identity, and belief. That even failure can be impactful. That even the absurd, a question about baseball at a Belgian roadblock, can shape the fate of an army. And it teaches us that in modern warfare, the battlefield includes the mind. The men of Operation Greif lie buried far from home. Their operation failed, but their story, for all its darkness, complexity, and contradiction, endures as a haunting lesson in the power of disguise, the fragility of trust, and the unteachable nature of cultural truth.